All right, it's 5 o'clock in California, 8 o'clock in New York. We welcome you to CODEPINK Congress. I'm Marcy Winograd, coordinator of CODEPINK Congress, and tonight we have a very relevant, exciting in the sense that we hope it will inform us as we go forward with our protests and our demands for divestment and demilitarization at our universities and beyond. So tonight's program is titled Campus Revolt, from Vietnam to Palestine. And our guests include Noor, who's the Palestine campaigner for CODEPINK, as well as Julia Norman, who's been on the ground in DC at George Washington University, I believe, and on Capitol Hill and in front of the Israeli embassy. Of course, Medea Benjamin is my co-host, co-founder of CODEPINK, and she's been all over the world. We'll hear about that. And Phyllis Bennis, who's the advisor to Jewish Voice for Peace and a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. She'll be giving us an historical look, the context of the student movement now as it relates to then during Vietnam. So it will be action-packed. We'll include a capital calling and emailing action at the end. Do stay with us. And we will ask you to call our senators to ask them to oppose the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. That's not appropriately named, but basically that's an act to conflate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. We know there are two very different things, and we'll discuss that more later, so do stay with us. For now, I would just want to emphasize the norms, and those include showing respect at all times for everybody in the chat or during the Q&As, and to assume good intentions. All right, so with that, let's go to some news updates. Medea, tell us what's happening. You've been up to a lot.
Well, you know, tomorrow was supposed to be the day that the State Department handed in its report on this National Security Memo 20, whether Israel was complying with U.S. law and international humanitarian law. And it's already clear that they're not going to submit the report tomorrow, that it's been delayed. And we can only imagine, wouldn't you like to be a fly on the wall, Marcy, to know what they're talking about or how are they going to thread this needle, because anybody who is prescient and reads the news knows that Israel is violating so many laws, committing so many war crimes, and yet the Biden administration wants to continue to support Israel. We know that 4 of the bureaus in the State Department already came out with a dissenting view saying Israel was not complying. So what is the State Department going to do with that? So that's why there is a delay. In the meantime, people on this call might have seen things like the independent task force report that was done by Josh Paul, who resigned from the State Department, Noor Erekat, constitutional lawyer, and others. That was a very, very good document that should be what the State Department puts out, with very detailed examples of how the U.S. is violating the Leahy Law, the Foreign Assistance Act, etc. And there have been many other reports that have come out that have shown that. Amnesty's got a new report. There were several branches of the UN that just came out with something yesterday showing the horrific conditions for women. So there is ample evidence. It's just a question of what the heck politically the State Department is going to do to try to cover up Israel's crimes. And U.S., you know, we're not even using the word complicity anymore. We're saying U.S. partnership in these crimes. So that's one thing. Marcy, you talked about this Anti-Semitism Act that passed the House and is now going to, it's been introduced in the Senate. We can talk more about that later. But we have been working hard on that one. There have also been other atrocious things that the Congress has done, like a letter from 12 senators that was sent to the International Criminal Court saying, these are all Republicans, saying, if you dare to issue arrest warrants for officials in the Israeli government, we will go after you. We will slap sanctions on you. We will not allow you and your families to come to the United States. And it ended up with the phrase saying, you have been warned. it was the most disgusting mafioso type letter. But this is who we're dealing with. And so we have been busy in the halls of Congress. Tomorrow there is another hearing where General Austin, Secretary of Defense, will be. We will be there as we've been every time he's appeared in Congress, telling him he's got blood on his hands. And tomorrow there will also be a couple of hearings that are just piling on top of other hearings and other manifestations, how Congress, particularly the Republicans, really are anxious to blow up the level of anti-Semitism in order to be able to justify the crackdown on the students. Some of you might have seen Mike Johnson when he went to Columbia University, or Lauren Boebert when she went to GW, and other Congress people. They've just been horrible. Tom Cotton, we went to his office today. He said that these are little Gazas and called them, disgusting and pro-Hamas terrorist groups on campus. So there are two hearings tomorrow. They're reaching down not only to the universities, because they are trying to get the mayor of DC to be coming and testifying on why she hasn't cracked down on the encampment there, but they're also reaching down to K through 12, kindergarten through 12th grade. Marcy, as a former teacher, you're looking like, oh my. And they want to know, and they want to talk about the anti-Semitism in those levels of the education. So there is a witch hunt going on in Congress. There is, as we know, a terrible crackdown on the students, and it's all a cover-up to what's going on in Gaza.
Thank you so much, Medea. Yes, the virulence of this crackdown suggests that our protests are very threatening to those who want to continue this genocidal policy. I don't even call it a partnership. I just call it U.S. Israel's genocide, U.S. Israeli genocide in Gaza, because that's what it is. With the Congress voting another $26 billion in arms, and President Biden signing that legislation, as well as legislation that includes a ban on funding UNRWA in Gaza, the lifeline for food, water, and medicine. Now we see a full-blown famine, even recognized by Cindy McCain, hardly a radical, but head of the World Food Program, on Meet the Press this last weekend, talking about a full-blown famine. So we can expect more crackdowns, but they're not working. I mean, they're not suppressing the dissent. We can see it just spreading, from one campus to another, and Noor's going to talk about that. I'm in Santa Barbara on Chumash land, and our university here, the University of California at Santa Barbara, has an encampment that started about a week ago. Today I was at the City College. We had a spirited march calling for the trustees to sign a ceasefire resolution, and I hear San Francisco is very active too. Cynthia, Papermaster, are you with us? If you are, I think you had a report for us. If not, we'll try to catch you later. Okay, so while we're on the program tonight, I encourage you to post in the chat your name, if you want, or a nickname, where you're from, and perhaps how you've been supporting the youth, the encampments, anything that you've done, or any ideas that you have for support. And support, we know, can take many forms. I have been supporting the local UCSB encampment, dog sitting, for an organizer, including all-night dog sitting. People need support to do this. So by all means, please share if you want how you are supporting the encampments, the youth, the protests, and how others might as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first guest, who is near and dear to our hearts. That is Noor, CODEPINK's Palestine campaigner. Noor she has been very active in sending out petitions and letters that you can sign. She created a toolkit for CODEPINK, and she has been basically our resource, our go-to person for organizing around Palestine. She is a graduate of DePaul University, and she'll talk about what's going on there. It's a private university, but right in there with the protests. So Noor, welcome to CODEPINK Congress.
Hi, Marcy, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on. I just want to say real quick, I think it's really cool that you brought up the fact that your dog's sitting at the encampments, and it really just goes to show that there's a role for everybody, and there's so many things that need to be done, and it's so important to like show up and figure out what that is and like see how you can plug in, because I guarantee you, number one, you're not going to want to leave because it's honestly really cool what's been going on despite the circumstances. But there's so many ways for you to like actually make an impact there. But to talk a little bit about what's going on in Chicago and kind of across the country is that, you know, students are standing their ground and they're saying, we will no longer accept our tuition dollars to, one, go to places we don't know about for universities with private investment portfolios, and two, to say, we are not going to let our tuition dollars go to genocide, which is not a crazy ask. It's not a crazy demand by any means. But the crackdown and, you know, even the response from people in Gaza has shown us that this escalation is exactly what we needed. And this escalation is absolutely necessary. When the encampments were first launched a few days into it, Bisan, who I'm sure a lot of you guys know is a journalist who's still in Gaza right now, said that it was the first time she felt hope in her 25 years of life. And I just feel like that's just a testament to the fact of what we're doing here and like the real impact that's making. The fact that it's reaching people in Gaza and they're feeling hopeful is just, honestly, I hope everybody here understands the gravity of that, because it's really incredible. But why is this escalation necessary, right? If we look at just what was happening overnight and into today, Israel was bombing Rafah, where 1.3 million Gazans have been seeking refuge from Israeli airstrikes and live ammunition. Although we know that there was really never a safe place in Gaza, you know, even in Rafah, they are under horrible conditions. But what we're seeing now is those people who were displaced at Rafah, who, by the way, most people in Gaza are refugees already. They're refugees within their own country. They might have been displaced in 1948, 1967, or even during one of the many bombings and sieges on Gaza. You know, Israel carpet bombs Gaza pretty much like every 4 years, roughly. These people are being displaced yet again. So they're going from southern Rafah, where, you know, they barely have access to food, water, medical supplies, shelter. They're living in tents. And now they're being sent back to central Gaza. So like Dir al-Bala area and Khan Yunis. And there's nothing. Like in Rafah, there's like maybe a small market. People can get a little bit of medical supplies, things they need on a daily basis. But now they're going somewhere where there's literally nothing. Like they're going to be forced to shelter in homes that are destroyed. They're going to be living literally on top of rubble and dead bodies. So what is happening at universities in the United States is absolutely necessary. And we can tell by the response that we're getting, right? All these things that Marcy mentioned. But I think for a lot of people, they might be wondering, like, why universities? Like, does it make sense? Like, they might not actually understand why universities are playing a role in Israel's genocide campaign in Gaza. And I think a lot of universities will separate themselves. They'll kind of take up this like neutral position of, you know, we're here for education and we want to make sure students' education and safety is prioritized. And, you know, that's our only job. When in reality, a huge part of these encampments is identifying universities as taking an active role in this genocide. Where universities invest their money directly is connected to this genocide. If they're invested in weapons companies, you know, those are the weapons companies that are literally making the bombs and the weapons that are going to Gaza. So if you read statements from universities, I've read a few, especially, you know, here at DePaul where I am, which I'll talk more about, you know, kind of taking up this position as like a neutral party when in reality that it's not the case at all. And that's a huge part of these encampments. It's kind of like calling out these universities and showing that like, no, you are truly taking an active role in this and you will be charged with genocide along with, you know, all the other war criminals that will be charging with genocide. So like I said, I'm here at DePaul. This is actually the university I graduated from. More importantly, I graduated from the SJP here, Students for Justice in Palestine. I was the president of the SJP for 2 years. And let me tell you guys, these demands that are being brought up here in these encampments are not new. We have been asking for divestment. We have been asking for DePaul to make their investment portfolio public. Like even before my time, I graduated in 2022. This was a campaign since 2011 when the SJP here started. So it has been over a decade now that students are calling on their universities and asking them, to not invest in genocide, because frankly, this has been an ongoing genocide for 76 years. So it's honestly been kind of incredible being here at DePaul. I know it sounds like a little weird to say, just considering the circumstances. And of course, it's like tiring and, especially when you read the news, like it's not fun, but just like witnessing the little village we've kind of built. Like Marcy mentioned that we were being called like little like Gazas. Like honestly, yeah, kind of. Like there are so many parallels that we can draw here and to the conditions people are living in Gaza. Not that they're any much the same, but the idea of community and keeping each other safe. We have a medical tent, a supply tent, free food and water. If there's an empty tent, you could just go sleep in it. So we're really cultivating a community here. And that's also been one of the key parts of these encampments. It's like building this community and this movement that is really going to drive us to our goals. And I think that's just as important as actually reaching our goals and like getting our demands met. But to just like speak to the repression a bit, at DePaul, we haven't been experiencing repression in ways that are super violent like other universities have. Just last night, the University of Chicago had their entire encampment cleared by the university police. Nobody was arrested, but it definitely wasn't an easy fight. But they did in the end end up clearing their encampment. At DePaul, we've had repression more in the sense of, kind of watering down why we're here, or our university taking up this role of like a neutral party when in reality, they're not neutral at all, right? But it's important to like reflect on like why are we being repressed? Because in reality, it doesn't feel great to be repressed, but it's kind of a win. It's like, okay, I'm doing something right. When you move your opposition, it kind of shows that you're actually getting to them. You're actually moving further on your goals. And these Zionists see their imperialist goals at risk now that students and the people of the world are honestly waking up to what's happening, to the point where they're feeling empowered to take action and they're responding to it. And it's no surprise that this response is violent, considering the violence that we're protesting here. I mean, we're protesting genocide, so we can expect some form of violence in response. So if you are at one of these encampments and you do feel like a little down on your luck, it's like important to kind of remind yourself like, okay, well, we're getting some pushback here. It's because we're actually doing something right. Use that as motivation to keep moving forward. In some other universities, it's been much worse. At UCLA and Columbia, there were mass arrests. So I am feeling at least a little grateful here at DePaul that I haven't been arrested or like violently removed from the campus. But we have had a few attacks from like Zionist agitators. Actually on Sunday, the Proud Boys were here, which is maybe the #1 anti-Semitic organization. And they were here protesting the encampment. And actually some of the administration were standing with them. So that's kind of unbelievable. Yeah, I'm not really proud to say that I'm a DePaul alum after that. But we do have like Zionist agitators that come here and, they try to deflect, they try to take us away from our goals. But I'm really, really proud of the students. They have a system of like keeping everybody safe and staying like steadfast on their goals and why they're here. And it's been super inspiring. I don't want to take up like too much time. I could go on and on. I've been here. This is like day 8, I think. I've gone home a couple of times though. Like I'm not gross. I need to like shower.
Well,
But
we'll follow up with some Q&A later on in the program. Thank you so much, Noor. CODEPINK's Palestine campaigner. Yeah, what you said resonated with me. At the encampment at the University of California at Santa Barbara, they have a schedule every day, and it often includes prayer sessions as well as teach-ins where students are teaching each other about indigenous culture, or one was from Chiapas to Palestine. It was about the Zapatistas. Another was about the disappearance of indigenous women. So really trying to make connections between all of these issues and movements, so important. We're going to now go to some video of what Noor referenced, the violence or the activism on our campuses. So Grace, if you can please show those videos now, we'll take a look. Yeah.
Southern Gaza, displaced Palestinians at camps in Rafah are thanking student protesters for their show of solidarity. They've been displaying messages of gratitude on their tents. They say that despite clampdowns by universities and the police, calls to end the war have been heard by the people besieged in Gaza.
This idea came to us after seeing what was happening in the news, especially the support from the students of the world, particularly the students of Columbia University, for standing with us, with their humanity, their hearts and their compassion. We hope the world will stand united with them. We hope for the world to support them, not to arrest them and imprison them.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest.
By viewers like you. Please support our work at democracynow.org/give. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. Graduation ceremonies have begun on college campuses across the United States as students continue their protests in solidarity with Palestine and calling on their schools to divest from Israel. On Friday, the student speaker at University of Toledo's graduate school commencement ceremony wore a keffiyeh hijab and a Palestinian flag over her graduation robe. This is part of the address by Maha Zaidan, a Palestinian-American graduating law student, president of the Graduate Student Association.
I apologize that this is not a typical graduation speech, but there is nothing typical about the times that we are living in. There is nothing typical about 15,000 children live-streamed deaths being watched. And there is nothing acceptable about our institutional complicity, silence, or the gross misuse of police force nationwide.
Maha Zaidan. Meanwhile, at the University of Michigan, students holding Palestinian flags briefly disrupted graduation ceremony Saturday as a plane flew overhead holding a banner that read, "Divest from Israel now, free Palestine." Also on Saturday at University of Virginia in Charlottesville, where in 2017, neo-Nazis chanted, "Jews will not replace us," police and riot gear stormed a Gaza solidarity encampment and arrested at least 25 student protesters. The raid came after The Intercept's Prem Thacker reported UVA, quote, appears to have unilaterally changed policy on tents to help justify calling upon the police to arrest protesters. Police have now arrested more than 2,500 students at pro-Palestine protests across the U.S. in the past 3 weeks, which includes 133 arrests on Thursday at SUNY New Paltz alone, where police violently raided a student encampment with batons and dogs. Well, we're joined by 3 guests from the school.
You're muted, Marcy.
That gives me chills watching that film. And we know that many people were taken to the hospital who were beaten before the police raid by thugs who stormed the barricades there with metal poles and bear spray, and were allowed to beat these protesters, some of them bleeding from the head, for hours before police did anything. And then the next day raided the encampment. All right, we're going to hear some more about these encampments from Julia Norman, who is with Code Pink. She's been with Medea on Capitol Hill and at George Washington University, also in front of the Israeli embassy. And after we hear from Julia, we will hear from Phyllis Bennis, who has a lot to say about the anti-war movement and how it has evolved from Vietnam to today. So first, Julia, welcome to Code Pink Congress.
Thank you so much, Marcy, and thank you everybody for having me. It's great to be here with Code Pink, and thank you, Nor, as well, for kind of providing an in-depth overview of what your experience has been and what the students are asking for. I want to first introduce myself as a student. I'm finishing a master's degree at American University, and while I'm not sleeping at the encampment, I am in the halls of Congress every day, and then I'm now finding myself going to the George Washington encampment at the end of the day, and that has become a place that Nor has noted, and fortunately for us in DC, just a place that is peaceful, that is uplifting, that inspires me very greatly for the network of community that it has created. You touched on the fact that there's medical services provided, there's free food, there's a library. It's for me, a vision of what community resources, when pulled together, when people stand in solidarity together, can be. So I'm very grateful that I get to go to that space and have good friends who are there and have been part of the encampment since the first day, with so many uncertainties, not knowing, how long this would go on, what the police response would be. But truly, the student movement across the entire United States, I think, has been our, as many people have called it, our collective conscience. One of the things that I have thought about a lot is for months before, like in the fall semester, I was writing to my university administration about my concerns about the genocide in Gaza. And I particularly am a graduate student in a school of, quote, international service. But we were not speaking in our School of International Service about the genocide at all. And we actually had a lot of administrative change to crack down on free speech. That included banning protests in buildings. They made it, they threatened disciplinary action. If you were to put up a poster, you had to then get the president of the university to approve any posters you wanted to post up. And all of this was a very clear attempt to limit pro-Palestinian speech. And anytime I would break those rules and I'd post just a poster for ceasefire. I mean, it's not a radical stance at all. And I found it taken down within the hour. And I never was receiving responses to my emails. And one of the things that I felt was so chilling was that, history tells us that we need students, we need universities behind social change, that if we are to kind of have a grassroots movement in this country, you need the young voter base. You need young people who are looking their future in the face to be involved in this. And it was also deeply concerning to see the institutions of, quote, decolonial thought and anti-racist research and all of these fancy names completely silent on Palestine. And, that was sobering and shocking for me, but it also made me feel like, gosh, if we don't have our universities behind this movement, we are not going to be making the progress that we need to be making. And that was such a clear attempt from administrations to chill and suppress speech using the Zionist weaponized rhetoric of anti-Semitism and doxing students and all of these tactics that we've seen for months. But what I think, Columbia starting this encampment and it catching fire, that was certainly not the intention of the Columbia students, I would imagine. I don't think that this was something where they thought we are going to see, over 150 schools have encampments in a series of a few weeks. But I think that the fact that students across the country saw this and saw the clear asks for divestment, which Nor pointed out, these have not been new asks. And it's very intelligent messaging as well to center Gaza, center the genocide, but to also say we're not going to talk about everything. We're going to address how our universities are responsible and complicit in the genocide by not disclosing their investments. And then further, we're asking for divestment and protection of our students and protection of speech. And a lot of schools and SJP groups go more into what they would like to see their universities do specifically. But it all kind of comes back to, as soon as we saw Columbia doing this, students are saying, you know, in my heart and in what the organizing I've been doing under pressure of administrations and under police threat, this is what I've been waiting for, so to speak. And to see it rise up in mass, and then it become a place that people from the surrounding communities can come to and also find solidarity with, I think is such a important like signpost to where we're headed, but also what people were looking for, because the protesting is so important. But sometimes that feels like hard to latch onto. If you don't have something that is consistent, if you don't have community around you, it feels difficult to know how to proceed. And so what I think the encampments have done is really create spaces where you find like-minded people, not just in the students, but across communities at large. And, you know, it's been very disappointing as well, I think, to see the crackdown, both from militarized police, such a necessary force and such double standards, like the fact that we watched for hours students at UCLA be brutalized before police showed up. And at the same time, that was the night that Columbia was raided, and we saw students thrown down the stairs and hundreds of militarized trucks coming. I mean, it's been astonishing, but what I hope, you know, people are waking up to, whether or not they've been paying attention to the genocide in Gaza or not, is that this issue, you know, they are cracking down, as Nora has noted, for a reason. They are afraid of the momentum and of the intelligence and bravery and drive and courageousness of these students, because there are real sacrifices. And I think that that also gets lost. And I wish that that was sometimes centered among the people who are trying to, you know, claim these students to be crazy radicals, or as Tom Cotton would say, freaks and fanatics, and, you know, just horrible language. But these students are so brave and clear and decisive, and also doing this at a time in which they have real consequences, not just for being arrested, but to be a student, to have invested your money and your time and your degree and your education, and the risks that that means for your family as well. And to know that I would jeopardize that, and I would do this in a very stressful time of my academic career, because on principle, this is the most important thing to do. So I think it's been incredibly moving. And I would just say at the GW encampment, waiting to see, there's a hearing tomorrow that's been called specifically to address how Mayor Bowser and the chief of police have failed to crack down on this anti-Semitic, you know, encampment. It's absurd. I was there earlier today, and there was, you know, a prayer circle happening at the same time people were singing, and then, you know, anyone's coming up and getting free food. So could not be farther from that reality. But potentially we might see a change tomorrow. But I think, you know, even if we were to pause today, and I talked to a lot of my friends in the encampment, Taz, who is one of our Code Pink heroes, who has been leading and consistently at the GW encampment every day, just about the experience, about the overwhelm. And, you know, they don't necessarily know where they're headed. Every day, every hour is kind of subject to, they have to wait and see, but they do know that what they're asking for, and they're committed to that. And whether or not the encampment is taken down or not, that drive and those values and those asks are going nowhere. So it's been, I think, an incredible, you know, movement forward for all of us. And it also gives me hope as a young person about the community that can be built when we look at other things as well, like the climate crisis, things that will pose a threat to all of us. And to just see people in my generation supporting one another and doing so despite real challenges makes me feel a lot better about our ability to be resilient moving forward.
Thank you so much, Julia. Norman. one of our organizers with Medea Benjamin in Washington, D.C., at the George Washington University encampment. What you say is really inspiring. And I agree. What I see at the University of California at Santa Barbara is an effort to envision what's next. You know, how do we move beyond this kind of extractive capitalist system to one that really values human life? I can remember the anti-war movement and how it gained momentum during Vietnam. You know, I'm older, a lot of us are older. And, here today we are, and I never thought that this conversation would have so much momentum. And I'm really grateful, not for the misery and the suffering, of course not, but for this colossal shift that I see in people's thinking about Palestine and the connections they're making to the theft of indigenous land in this country. So before we introduce our next guest, Phyllis Bennis, so glad to have Phyllis with us tonight, we're going to watch a short film, a short video made by Breakthrough News, connecting what happened at Kent State with some of the calls that we're hearing today from Republicans in Congress. So Grace, if you can cue that up, that would be fantastic.
Getting shut down with brute police force. But some are calling to go further, to bring in the National Guard.
There is an appropriate time for the National Guard. We have to bring order to
This would be history repeating itself on the 54-year anniversary of the Kent State Massacre. Here's what happened. Despite promising to end the war, Nixon announced on April 30th, 1970, that the U.S. was invading Cambodia as part of its war on Vietnam, and young people across the country were outraged. Students at Kent State called an emergency protest. The Army Reserve Officer Training Corps on campus was burned to the ground in revolt. The Ohio governor responded by calling in the National Guard. He demanded their planned mass march for May 4th be canceled, and they even circulated a fake flyer announcing it had been canceled. But the students were undeterred. Thousands of students gathered on the campus commons, despite 1,000 National Guardsmen. The protest continued in the face of tear gas and bayonets. And just when it looked like the National Guard would retreat, at the top of a hill, they began shooting from over 70 feet away. They fired 67 rounds in 13 seconds, killing 4 students and injuring 9. No shots had been fired in the other direction. It was unprovoked. The massacre was a mask-off moment for the US empire to an entire generation. Student strikes swept every college in the country, and 50 schools shut down entirely. And this wasn't the end of the violence against students either. 10 days later, cops killed 2 students protesting the war at Jackson State College, a historically black college in Mississippi. So when politicians and administrators call for the National Guard, this is the ugly history they're invoking.
Gaza faces.
All right. Kent State, what was it, 57 years ago? We're going to look back and look forward with our next guest. Phyllis Bennis directs the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, focusing on the Middle East, U.S. militarism, and issues with the United Nations. Phyllis Bennis is also a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. In 2001, she helped found the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and more recently spent 6 years on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace, where she now serves as its international advisor. Phyllis Bennis will explore the people power behind the anti-Vietnam War movement of the 60s and the Palestine Solidarity Movement for Liberation today. Welcome, Phyllis Bennis, to CODEPINK Congress.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this, CODEPINK. Thanks for all of you for being here tonight. We've had 7 months of genocide in this round of assault on Palestinians, and we still have not achieved a ceasefire, the most important thing. The definition of ceasefire has actually changed, I would say, during those 7 months. It's no longer only just stop the firing. It also means stop sending weapons, stop selling them, stop giving them, stop all the weapons. And it says there must be humanitarian aid at a massive scale because famine has now come to Gaza. It's no longer a looming famine, a coming famine. It's now a famine today. And on top of that, we need the ceasefire itself. So all of that is still at the core of what the encampments are about, of what the movement is about. Medea and Noor and all the rest have reported on the surrounding crises that is going on around the country now and going on in the region, and ceasefire is still central to all of that. There are important differences and similarities between the movement today and the Vietnam era anti-war movement. One of the most important, of course, is that what's going on in Gaza is not a war. It's not a war between countries. It's not a war that both sides have bombs and not that both sides were equal in Vietnam, but it was a war between armies as well as a guerrilla war in the South. That's not the case in Gaza. Gaza is the legacy of 75 years of settler colonialism based on ethnic cleansing that has become apartheid and has now become genocide. It's a very different relationship of power. Vietnam was a long war. It went on with the French for decades and then more than 10 years with the United States. And we have to be very modest, I think, in how we think about the role of the anti-war movement, because unlike the situation here where the US president could stop what's going on in Gaza, not quite overnight, but almost overnight, by stopping the weapons and stopping the cash. That's what enables the genocide to go forward. That was not the case in Vietnam. The movement did not end the war in Vietnam. The Vietnamese won the war. It was a very different military dynamic. And the US in that period never had that same power to end the war. Also, a big difference was that there was no constituency in the US that had or thought they had a personal connection, a personal loyalty, a personal empowerment of the South Vietnamese, the side that the US was supporting. There wasn't that kind of emotional connection, perhaps until the very last years of the war. That's not the case here. Here you have a situation where far too many people in this country believe that the lives that matter in Gaza and in Israel are Israeli lives, and that Palestinian lives matter less. There's a racism that undergirds US policy. That was true in Vietnam, but it was racism of a different sort. What we're seeing right now is the result of this kind of racism, where you see the Israeli policy based on Jewish, not the notion of a Jewish state, but Jewish supremacy against the 20% of the population of 1948 Israel, which is about 20% of the population is Palestinian, who now, as of 2018, officially and legally do not have the same rights as other citizens of Israel who happen to be Jewish. So you have this preeminence of racism in both situations, but it plays out obviously in somewhat different ways. Another big difference that I think is important is the situation that was faced by our movement when the crisis in Gaza going on right now erupted in early October of 2023. It was not the beginning of a war. It was not the beginning of Israeli assault on Gaza. It was not the first step towards a war. It wasn't any of those things. It was one more attack after decades, generations of assault, of ethnic cleansing, of settler colonialism, of apartheid that had shaped Israeli domination over Palestinian land and Palestinian lives all that time. But what we had here, which was not the case in Vietnam, was 20 or 30 years of organizing in the United States of a Palestinian rights movement that had played an incredibly important role in shifting the discourse, shifting the public discourse, the media discourse, ultimately a little bit just beginning to shift the policy discourse. But ultimately, that set the stage. But ultimately, the movement that erupted very soon after October 7th was a spontaneous movement. I don't think that we in the Palestine rights movement could claim that we created that movement. We organized, we were out there from the beginning, and there was a spontaneous movement that was a human movement of people across the country, all kinds of different people, came out because they were seeing in real time on their screens, moment by moment, a genocide taking shape. And people were saying, this is not okay. Yeah, maybe we were supporters of Israel. Maybe it was sort of a good thing. Maybe they're kind of a democracy. None of that turns out to be true. And none of it turned out to be enough to stop people from saying, this has to stop. We need a ceasefire now. So within weeks, we had 80% of Democrats demanding an immediate ceasefire, 68% of the American people overall saying we want an immediate ceasefire. It took years for that to happen in Vietnam. We had, as you all know, we targeted a multiplicity of targets right from the beginning: Congress, the White House, corporations, the targets identified through BDS. It's become clearer now that the role that particularly the Biden White House plays, they could stop it. Biden himself could stop it almost overnight. But we appropriately targeted all these institutions of power that were making this genocide possible. The tactics, we had a multiplicity of tactics: sit-ins, occupation of landmarks, Grand Central Station, the Statue of Liberty, all these things. The street protests, the resignations of high-ranking officials in a number of institutions of the government, the bird dogging of members of Congress and the president and the vice president and the Secretary of State. The constituencies, the wide diversity of constituencies, Palestinians, Arab Americans, the youth across all races and classes, Black people, Jews, all the people of color, Democrats. And that became broader with time. And time was somehow compressed this time, so that things that took years in building a movement against the war in Vietnam took weeks. You know, even in the context of the Palestine Solidarity Movement, we talk about how it took 20 years to normalize the understanding that what is going on in relations between Israel and Palestine is apartheid. It took 20 years to normalize that understanding. Palestinians had understood it long before. South Africans had understood it long before. But it took us 20 years in this country to get it. It took about 20 weeks, or maybe even less, to normalize the understanding that this was genocide, which means deliberate, specific intent to destroy all or part of a group in order to suppress that group. So all of these things show us the power of what happened in a very, very short time, all of which, of course, one of the biggest differences was that of social media, that people were seeing it in real time, day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, on their phones, on their computers, on their tablets. There was a familiarity with it instantly of what genocide looked like. During the Vietnam War, there was still 3 television stations, and they all had half-hour news shows all at the same time. You could pick one. They were all pretty much the same: CBS, NBC, and ABC. And you got 22 minutes of news that had to cover the country, the world, and everything else. So the actual coverage of the war in Vietnam was very, very scanty. We didn't have anything like what we have now. The movement that grew up around the war in Vietnam was the first movement that was after the McCarthy period, with all of the cultural repression. It came to life in the context of the Cold War. The Vietnam War was the hottest of the hot wars of the Cold War era. And in that context, the leadership was different. It was white men, often selected because they had been indicted for one thing or another. The Chicago conspiracy defendants became the leaders in many ways. Many of them were also brilliant strategic analysts. That was great. But it was also true that they were chosen by the fact that they were indicted for the conspiracy in Chicago that didn't really exist, and chosen by the media to play that role. Women and people of color who were just as active in that movement did not play that same role. The role of the draft was crucial in a way that we don't have this time around, that made it personal for students in particular. They were the age of draftees, and the universities became part of the elites. Those who could figure out a way to get out of the draft could go to college, could go to universities. So there was a class distinction that became very important, among other things, in how the police viewed student protesters. The cops tended to be working class, and they saw students, they were not wrong about this part, they saw students as those who were privileged enough to have stayed out of the war while their sons who were fighting in Vietnam. So that was a huge difference. The encampments that we see today on the campuses really parallels the Vietnam movement in many ways. It's student-based. There hasn't been a student-based movement really since Vietnam. The anti-apartheid movement was rooted in primarily the Black churches. The Central America movement was also rooted in more white Protestant churches. The anti-war movement against Afghanistan and Iraq were much broader communities that were involved. These were not student-based movements. Students were part of all of them, but we didn't see what we see now with the encampments. It is different because the encampments are only one section of this incredibly broad, spontaneous movement against U.S. support for genocide in Gaza. But we're seeing now, and we don't know exactly how influential they're going to be eventually, but having the specific demands of the students, of their campuses, so that they're saying the central issue is still Gaza, the central demand is ceasefire, and we need divestment, and we need transparency, and we need amnesty, all of those things. In Vietnam, the demands were only about the war. The complicity was part of it, but the demands were much more focused on the government to bring home the troops. So there's a challenge. It's not easy. The students have done a great job of it. Some of their supporters outside haven't done it so well. The students have been incredible in keeping the ceasefire demand central while including the demands for divestment as a direct demand on their own institution, on their own campus. So in a sense, the encampments are this kind of direct action, while other kinds of actions continue and are still underway. There's also, of course, the similarity of the kind of repression that the students are facing right now. This question I was raising about the role of the police versus the protesters, we're seeing that this time there's an anger, there's a cruelty that we're seeing from some of these police going after these young students on their campuses. And the rest of our movement has a huge responsibility to help protect the students at these encampments. There was an incredibly moving short video. Some of you may have seen it. It was circulating on social media a week or two ago. I'm not even sure which of the campuses it was. It was one of the smaller encampments that was surrounded. The entire encampment was surrounded by faculty wearing yellow vests and holding signs that said, "If you come for our students, you have to get through us first." It was incredibly powerful, seeing that kind of embrace, that kind of solidarity, that kind of protection of the students. And we have the protection, the obligation to help the students with what they're studying, what they're learning, how they're coming to understand the role of the U.S. in this war. We're looking at a situation where there's been I think it's up to about 2,500 arrests, mass arrests across the country in these encampments, 0 arrests so far of counter-protesters. It's a travesty. It's an absolute travesty. The results of this, and I want to finish up so we have time for questions and discussion. The half dozen campuses that have begun negotiating with the students about the terms for considering divestment. This is an enormous success. This is an enormous accomplishment that we've been working on, as Noor said, I think it's been, or Julia, that it's been more than a decade. It's been since 2005 that the BDS call went out globally for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions to bring nonviolent pressure to bear against Israel to end its violations of international law. We now have half a dozen campuses where the administration is negotiating to do exactly that, recognizing Israeli apartheid will probably have to come later, but it has come back to national attention. And the movement remains united on the key demand around ceasefire. We've had 7 months where that definition of ceasefire has broadened and expanded. So it's no longer simply stop the bombing right now. It's stop the bombing and stop the weapons going from the United States and allow in humanitarian aid. All 3 are required if we are serious about what a ceasefire looks like. And that's broadly understood and broadly welcomed across the country. We also have through this broad popular framework in the US, we have support for the first time in ways that didn't look the same during Vietnam. There was international support, both at the public level, the protest level, and at the level of governments, because there was then a socialist camp that supported Vietnam, supported them militarily, supported them economically. That was very important. We don't have that now. Palestine doesn't have that, doesn't have it from the Arab states, doesn't have it from anyone other than the public, the civil society movements around the world, but it has support from South Africa, and now the International Court of Justice, and potentially the International Criminal Court, have been reclaimed not as instruments of colonial power, but as instruments of the global South to challenge colonial power. So this gives new energy and new capacity, I think, to our movement now that we didn't have during the Vietnam movement in the same way. So the last thing I just want to say is that I think a challenge that we face is that right now, and this is maybe similar to parts of the Vietnam movement, but not exactly the same, too many people, Democratic Party operatives of various sorts, and too many anti-war activists are focusing, because they're focusing a lot on the elections that are 6 months away, and they're focusing on not allowing a fascist to come to power. They are trying to focus attention on how to convince the uncommitted voters, the voters who say, I will not vote for Biden because he is supporting genocide. How do we convince those people that they still have to vote for Biden? And I think we have to be clear that's the wrong question. That's not the question to ask. The question is, how do we get Biden to change his position, not just because of the election, but because this is a matter of life and death right now, today, not 6 months from now. We can't wait 6 months. So the focus on getting Biden's policy to change, I think, is where we, in a similar way to Vietnam, we see our job. It's not to figure out how to get young Palestinians who will not vote for the person who is enabling the genocide of their families and shouldn't be put in that position. How instead we come back to changing that reality so that's not the choice that people have to make 6 months from now, because right now things will have changed. That's the potential, that's the hope that we see from the encampments, from the student movement that has taken the lead in this broad popular movement that has been led by different parts of it, but right now is being led by the students. And we should all be incredibly proud of what they are continuing to do.
Thank you so much, Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies, advisor to Jewish Voice for Peace. We appreciate your words of wisdom and the salient questions that you raise. And we have about 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A. People have been posting questions in the chat, and so we're going to raise a few of those. And we're going to ask all of our guests, so that's Noor as well. If we could highlight Noor and Julia. We have our 3 women, yeah. Okay, I've noticed that the encampments are led by women, at least they are locally. And I just wanted to add that another demand that I'm hearing locally is not just to divest, but to demilitarize, because a lot of these campuses are doing the research. They are pipelines to the war industry. And they've captured the STEM programs, these science and technology programs, to steer students into war making. And that's got to be a demand to cut those ties. So with that, Medea, maybe you can pose the first question.
Well, I think a question that is on everybody's mind is what happens when the semester ends? Where do these encampments go? How do we keep the energy up when it's the summer vacation? And maybe I'll start with you, Noor. What do you think might be the short-term future of these encampments?
So this was always kind of like a question when we were running campaigns, like as student organizations at my time at university. And I think that for like the broader, for like more like the current movement to end the genocide, the current genocide in Gaza, I think what it's going to take is like more involvement from the public, not like not necessarily a student-led effort, but for us to take on our own encampments, whatever that looks like, to be inspired by this action and maybe try to recreate it or replicate it or use parts of it in some way to continue that pressure. I think when it comes to the students, it looks like continuing that communication with administration, and kind of like doubling down on their research and their strategy and really setting their ducks in order for when the semester starts again and they have that power to leverage on campus when school is back in session. But I think ultimately, like, the students can probably gauge what would work best at their universities.
Do either Phyllis or Julia want to add to that? You're mute,
You're on
Phyllis.
mute.
I'd like to add just one quick thing, which is I think that those of us who are not students need to be very careful not to push the students to do what they can't do. Many of the students who are leading the encampments are students of color, are working class students, are foreign students, and immigrant students. Most of those students need to be home getting jobs in the summer to help support their families. And it becomes a sort of moralistic issue to say, if you really believe in ending genocide, you would stay here for the summer, when these are people who need to support their families. So I think we have to be very careful, and I appreciate Noor saying the students will know how to deal with their own encampments for the summer, whether they stay as encampments or not. The students who are going to be negotiating hopefully will be able to continue those negotiations in some form over the summer and then continue them in the fall. Those are medium to long-term goals, the divestment stuff. That doesn't happen overnight. That's not going to stop the genocide now. We can't wait on those actions to stop the genocide. So the work comes back to communities as a whole, which will probably include some of the same tactics, sit-ins and street actions and bird dogging candidates, all of those things.
And let me just ask Julia, because you've been going to the encampment outside the Israeli embassy and the one outside of Blinken's house. So maybe you could mention those.
Yeah, I would just say I'd echo the points previously made. I have been going since at least the encampment outside of the Israeli embassy was formed by Hazami and just a group of over 100 different MV community who are protesting. Oh, I know you did. Okay. Are protesting every day. We have created like kibbutz Israel, or our little Palestine, to protest the genocide, the embassy of genocide every single day. There's one outside of Anthony Blinken's home that's been there for over 100 days, reminding the Secretary of State, who is largely one of the few individuals largely responsible for the genocide in Gaza, living very close in Virginia. And that is a space much like the encampment that brings people together. But it's just one creative example of how to escalate and how to commit yourself to ending the genocide in Gaza. And I think the students are all going to have to individually decide based on their circumstances where to go from here. But I think, again, thinking about what was the impetus for this, none of this was planned, but it caught fire and brought people in. And I think now it's on us to take that momentum and take those same asks and find new ways to channel it and not feel like as well. And I've talked to students, my friends, about this, that the burden is also somehow on them to set the terms of how this dissolves, or whatever term you want to use. What they have done is center Gaza again, and it's up to everyone to continue forth with that.
Thank you, Julian. I do want to point out that Congress is often on recess during the summer months. So when they're in district, that's the time to be confronting them. More and more senators and House members are writing circulating letters to the Biden administration to stop sending offensive weapons to Israel. So they listen, they are hearing us, and we just need to apply more and more pressure. That's my feeling. So this one question was asked several different ways. I'm going to ask you now. It's probably the question of the night, and that is, what can I do? I listen, I'm horrified, I feel so helpless, so frustrated. What should I be doing? Who wants that? Who wants to take that?
I can, oh yeah, you go ahead.
No.
Okay. All right, sure. Well, something that I talked about when I first started speaking was the fact that Marcy is like dog sitting for people at the encampments. And I think it really is a testament to the fact that there is a role for everybody. There is something for everybody to do. There's so much that needs to be done. And right now, with these encampments kind of being the center of the escalation in the movement for Palestinian liberation in the US, even outside of the US, that if you can be there, you should be there. Even if you don't spend the night, there's so many things you can do. You can man the supply tent. You can man the medical supply tent, food, water, whatever it is. Bring them the materials that they're asking for. Try to be BDS compliant. But to plug into your local community, I can assure you that wherever you are, there's something to do. And if you don't know something locally, there's ways to get involved virtually, like support students or organizations. Honestly, reach out, put yourself out there, because there is going to be a place for you, and there's work that you do need to do. You might have to seek it out a little bit, but it's worth the journey.
I would just like piggyback off of that and also note that one of the things that's been inspiring about the kibbutzes, or these encampments outside of Blinken's house and the Israeli embassy, is that people bring a lot of their different skills. So some people, they bring art and they make the posters that are then lining the streets. Some people are bringing food to the people that are protesting. Some people are writing poetry, and then that poetry gets posted somewhere and you hear it recited, several places. Some people stand on their corner of their street with a sign, and you do not know who is not thinking about this, who has compartmentalized the genocide in Gaza as somehow not a part from their life, and sees you driving, as they're driving by, and it makes them think about things differently. So I think it is on all of us to feel like what resonates most with us. And as a grad student in DC, I feel very fortunate that this is like a hub of activity. But even in terms of thinking we're going into the summer, our leadership is everywhere. And I do think that the pressure really makes a difference. Code Pink had a call like a month ago or so when they were talking about Canada's ceasefire resolution. One of the things that stuck with me is the fact that they were just hounding their officials of all levels of government and at the corporate level, every single place that they went. And that takes a lot of people invested in putting pressure on leadership. And doing the research too, because some people are more comfortable being the forces in the front. But there's a lot of organizing that goes into all of this kind of work that some other people could lend their skills to as well.
Thank you, Julia. Any thoughts, Phyllis?
Yeah, I think both of what Nora and Julia have just said is absolutely right. It goes down to do what you can where you are. It may mean going to an encampment and working with the students, but that's certainly not the only thing going on. There needs to be work in every church, in every synagogue, in every temple, in everything. In trade unions, the unions are coming out so strong right now. There's a new resolution, a new statement from, it's something like 100,000 campus workers, unionized campus workers across the country, issued a joint statement coming out in support of the students. Those kinds of statements keep up the pressure on the media, on the administration, on Congress, that, remember, this is not a minority position like it was in the beginning of the movement against the war in Afghanistan, for instance, where 88% of the population supported going to war, and it took us years to turn that around. Right now, we have 80% of Democrats saying we need an immediate ceasefire. We have 68% of the people of this country as a whole saying this. Much stronger among young people, among people of color, in all those categories. The Jewish community is split on this, but more broadly as well. So all of that needs to be built up and built on. So there's something to do everywhere. If you're in a parents group, if you're in a book club, in all those ways, make that a place of discussion, a place of debate to convince more people, because eventually it will become too costly politically for them to continue it.
Thank you, Phyllis. And even if you're not in a group, you know people, you have friends, you have family members, some of whom may disagree. They may not be vociferous in their disagreement. They might be open to a conversation, have a conversation. These hard conversations are hard, but we have to have them.
Can I just
All
say one thing? I just saw one of the questions was, why is there such silence among the churches? There isn't. There's enormous activity going on among the churches. The New York Times, the ad for 1,000 Black ministers, that was a call for ceasefire a couple of months ago. It was the type was so tiny you couldn't even read any of the names because they had so many. They didn't have room for, I think it was like 2-point type, something like that. The churches are doing a ton. They're doing interfaith work. They're doing work within their own denominations. They're two of the main denominations that have already taken positions divesting their multi-million-dollar accounts, their retirement accounts for all their staff. This has been going on for years, and they're continuing to do that work. In South Africa right now, the conference that's going on this coming week, the strongest part of it is a global church-based mobilization that included primarily church folks, faith-based folks from here in the U.S., from a few from the U.K. and South Africa, coming together to figure out more strategy for working within the Christian churches. And then, of course, the work that Jewish Voice for Peace is doing, and If Not Now, and the other Jewish anti-occupation and anti-Zionist organizations has been extraordinary, because that challenges this claim that we're doing this to defend and protect Jewish students. So all of those kinds of works are already underway, and all of it needs to be shored up and strengthened and needs more people.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Our guests, Phyllis Bettis, Noor, Julia Norman. Let's thank them and unmute and tell our guests how much we appreciate what they're doing.
But don't leave. Remember, we have
Yay!
Thank you.